Moghalu was the former deputy governor at the Central Bank of Nigeria. Good morning to you, Prof, from Abuja, if I can see you. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you clearly. You are wearing a blue suit, so that will confirm that I can see you.
Okay. All right. Very good.
Okay. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let's get started. Coronavirus, a health crisis, a human tragedy. We are seeing close to 3 million cases right now around the world. It has far-reaching economic implications, disrupting people's livelihoods and lives. Speak to me about perhaps your judgment of the measures that we've taken or that we are putting in place so far in Nigeria. Are they bold and meaningful that will get us out of this challenge?
You know, I understand the difficulties that the government faces in Nigeria in responding to the COVID challenge. And governments all over the world have experienced a lot of challenges. So let's put this in context and remember that we're a developing country. Now, even in that context, I think that there is a lot that the Nigerian government could do better in responding to the COVID disaster that we have now. And there are several ways of looking at it. Depends on what angle interests you. There is the public health challenge, which we know. Are we ready to confront this pandemic in terms of testing, in terms of capacity for hospital beds, and so on? It doesn't look like we are. The Nigerian Centers for Disease Control is struggling gallantly, mightily. But there's the backdrop of decades of weak or no investment in public health in Nigeria. And so they cannot, suddenly do magic if the pandemic becomes widespread within the Nigerian population. And that's where a lot of effort has to go into to prevent, community spread. And that's why, of course, there was the lockdown. Now, the lockdown raises a lot of issues. Clearly, the lockdown, has not been accompanied by what should go with it, which is effective and efficient distribution of palliatives to Nigerian citizens. And that is either in cash or in kind. That has not happened. And that is what tells you the dysfunction of the Nigerian state. That is what tells you that we really are a failing state from what we have seen so far. Because there's a lot of talk about giving palliatives to 3.6 million people. But the scale of this is huge. You've created several new layers of unemployment through the lockdown, which is necessary to stop the spread of the pandemic. But you cannot keep people at home for too long in a poor country like Nigeria, people who earn daily and have no savings. What do you do? So the weakness of the government has been exposed very strongly in this whole thing. Then there is, of course, the problem of the collapse of the oil markets and what it means for Nigeria's fiscal management. Are we going to go into a sovereign debt crisis at this rate? Because we have our debt stock is about 84 billion, and we are about to borrow $3.4 billion from the IMF with their rapid financing facility. And the government is also looking for another $3.5 billion from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. If all those loans go through, that's $7 billion. Now, of course, nobody's talking about the 22 billion Chinese loan. I think they should just chalk that out of the window. There's no basis for that. So we have a fiscal crisis on our hands. No revenues coming into the government, no fiscal savings, and then a lot of borrowing that is going on. So this is my assessment. My assessment is that the palliative effort should have been far more robust. It should be far more transparent. It should be effective, but it's not.
Okay.
So that's how I see it.
Okay. Just like you've said, we talked. I spoke with. We had a town hall on AIT.live virtual town hall forum on Friday. I moderated that, and I spoke with the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, Disaster Management and Social Development. When I asked her about the issue of those palliatives, what I understood, or what I am understanding from what the government is doing, is precisely there are no palliatives for coronavirus pandemic. What the government is doing is extending the conditional cash transfer, which they have been doing at least in the since 2016 or thereabout, since this administration came in. So I did pose the question to the minister on Friday that there are no palliatives, madam. What we are seeing is that it's conditional cash transfer. So what it means is that for those 2.6 million households on the register, if you are not on that register, you are not entitled to a conditional cash transfer. So we must...
That's a scandal.
Yes, so we must demarcate these things, and the government must really clearly spell out what they're doing and should come out clearly to say that this is the coronavirus pandemic palliative, so that in case you are not on that register, but you're also poor and vulnerable, you can get it. I really don't know how government is thinking at this time.
Look, Nancy, there are 100 million people in Nigeria who live below the poverty line of $2 a day. So, that's why your point is very important, that the government should have, reacted with a specific, response to the coronavirus. Extending the social investment scheme is a joke, quite frankly, because it just scratches the surface of the numbers of millions of people impacted by this pandemic. And that's why I say that this pandemic has shown very clearly the extent of weak state capacity that we have or don't have in Nigeria. So it's quite painful to see. And therefore, when I called for a lockdown, I said the government should totally scramble the 2020 budget. They would need at least 2 trillion, 2 to 5 trillion. But let's just give them slack and say 3 trillion. To respond to this pandemic. Instead, there is no real response in terms of the financial resources budgeted for households. There is even no clear threshold how you determine the people who will be eligible to receive these palliative measures. And that's the first problem. So there's just a lot of disorganization, and it's quite sad to see. In countries like Ghana, in South Africa, other African countries, even in Senegal, I think we are seeing a rather more effective response, even if they have challenges as well. But the response is quite planned, and you can see some organization in what's going on.
Yes, you just spoke of Senegal. I also saw over the weekend that they are doing some things locally to test their citizens that will cost less than $1. Unlike
innovation.
Yes, innovation. And I'm wondering, I said, okay, fine. If we can't we copy and paste? Let's just go to Senegal or find them out. What exactly is the problem? And that brings me, we'll come back to the issue of monetary or fiscal policy later. But since we're around this, that brings me to the question of leadership. How do you think that we can handle leadership at this point in time? Leadership on its own, it's like a difficult thing to even talk about. Then leadership through change or leadership through crisis.
Well, we are where we are. We have what we have. I mean, I don't suppose there are no elections planned in 2020. But I think that the people who have responsibility, the federal government and all the state governors, really need to rise up at this moment and go beyond themselves, go beyond what they are used to. They should bring in experts to advise them and help them through this period of crisis. So, the leadership response has, there's been an attempt, but it has not been strong enough because the people have not been communicated to very effectively. They have not been roused as one country to respond to this global threat of the pandemic. And so there's a lot of room left for rumors, a lot of room left for distrust. And there are allegations of even corruption with whatever is going on in terms of the social program or any attempt at palliatives. People are told that their communities are going to receive something, and then you bring a bag of rice for one big community or a local government. I mean, come on. So I think there are lessons in this for both the government and for Nigeria's citizens. Leadership determines the rise and the progress or the failure and the retrogression of nations. Don't joke with this question of leadership when we talk about it. But the leaders we have are the leaders that are a reflection of the society that we are. They're not from Mars. So we also have to look at ourselves and our process of leadership selection. What are we looking at? Are we just looking at politicians and political parties and party structures? Or are we looking for people who have competence and capacity and a vision to take Nigeria into the 21st century as a modern state? That's the challenge. And the jury is still out. Let's see whether COVID will bring any change to the way Nigerian people look at the question of leadership.
Still on this leadership recruitment process, because you've just said that we deserve the kind of leadership that we have, because it seems our leaders still come out of our own communities. How true is that, especially bearing in mind the decades of the kind of leadership that we've had in the country from military days to now, and you're still seeing that recycling of former military rulers. Obasanjo was a military ruler, you know, President Buhari was a former military ruler and all of that. How are these leaders across board, and I'm choosing my words carefully, how are these leaders across board, especially now that we have a coronavirus pandemic challenge, not just in Nigeria, but across the world, how are they able to discover, design, and deliver? The word is discover, decide, design, and deliver. Yes, 4 Ds I wanted to say. With this crisis, to be able to manage this crisis better?
The only way they can do that is to, as an emergency measure, call in and totally delegate to competent capacity to do so. Because the way public policy, or what pretends to be public policy in Nigeria, has been framed and executed in the past is not the way it should be. Public policy should be based on evidence. There should be evidence-based public policy. There should be proper design and delivery of public policy. There should be risk management. There should be performance management. All these things have not been done. What happens in Nigeria and what people pretend is public policy is just people just making political statements, statements of intent, you know, statements of aspiration. Government will, or, you know, but and the people themselves are not strong enough to be able to hold their government accountable for the failures of public policy, which we see all around us, whether it's in the health system, whether it's in the inability to identify who should get palliatives, whether it's in the failure to even earmark palliatives in the first place. We have no fiscal savings. Why? Because we have blown, you know, the excess crude account. We are now trying to raid the sovereign wealth fund. So we have no savings. And we have relied on oil for too long. And of course, many of us have been saying this, that day is here. At the rate the oil price is going, it's going to be a very interesting ride over the next 6 months in Nigeria.
True. Let's come to the issue of China. I want us to talk about this. You know, the novel coronavirus, some call it a global disease. Some call it Chinese virus. We've heard President Donald Trump call it Chinese virus, while others believe that it's also part of a conspiracy to rule the world. Where do you actually stand? Because the central question will be, do you think that the world would easily forget the role that China played in exporting the virus, especially as it concerns dilly-dallying antics on sharing vital information with the world?
Well, I think that's a problem that China will face for many years to come. There's going to be a lot of distrust of China. But let me be very clear. I don't believe in these conspiracy theories. This is not the first global pandemic we're having in the world. We had SARS. We've had a lot of other things, HIV/AIDS. We have TB. We have malaria. You know, these things are not the products of conspiracy theories. They're the products of natural scientific occurrences, and some countries have been able to prepare effectively and respond to them. So yes, China will have a problem because it does appear that they underestimated or underreported what was happening in Wuhan. But I think, beyond that, there will be other consequences. First of all, for African countries like Nigeria, who are exposed to China in so many ways, and even trying to become more exposed with a proposal to borrow as much as $17 billion from China, people now have to begin to rethink. Are we now in a new era of a second colonization? Everything is China. The global supply chain is China. China is the world's factory. A lot of countries are going to pull back from China after the coronavirus, and they're going to try to make their supply chains a little bit more nationally self-reliant. That's number one. Number two, for African countries, they have to look at their relationship with China in a new light. I think we should stop behaving like abused spouses who think that the next person who smiles at us actually loves us, when maybe actually they don't. African countries have for too long demonized the West, and then they turned to China in their response to the West. But it hasn't been better for Africa than the experience with the West. It's the same thing. The Chinese have a world view of global domination, trying to do it in a very stealthy way, very clever way. They're telling us that we're brothers, we're fraternal this, we're fraternal that. The West will be wasting your time with discussions about human rights. Deal with us, no questions asked. And we fall for that because we're not serious ourselves. What is our world view? Where do we want to be in the world? How do we plan to get there? You cannot just move from the West to China, but you don't have your own agenda. But you don't understand that the Chinese have their own agenda.
Now, Prof, the question would be, with what is happening right now, do you think that responsibility can be demanded at this point from Nigeria with the enormous influence that China has on Nigeria? We saw what happened even last week, the manhandling of our citizens, and just days after China said it's giving us some money. Can responsibility be demanded from China, from our government, and how?
Yes, they can and they should. They can and they should. You can't be so poor that you lose your dignity. Look, I've been around the world, and I've seen countries that are poor but maintain their dignity. They don't allow themselves to be pushed around by China and by any global power. And so I think, but the problem is that if our leaders and those in authority do not have this, intellectual worldview, this philosophical view of the world, if all we see of ourselves is that we are Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, but we don't see ourselves as Nigeria as a country, we don't see ourselves as the biggest country, black race in the world, and based on that, we should have an ambition. And based on that, we must relate with China or any other world power in a certain way that ensures mutual self-respect and the protection of our national interest. If you don't have that in the leadership, it's difficult for accountability to be demanded and obtained. So there may be routine motions of calling in Chinese ambassador and calling in Chinese authorities or protests. We have seen African countries express themselves on the terrible racist treatment of Africans in China. But beyond that, what have they done? Have they taken any action to affect the interests of China in a way that hurts them and their economic interests so that they will behave themselves?
Okay, Prof, let's go back to the monetary and fiscal policy side. How big and broad do you think that, or how big and broad should fiscal and monetary stimulus packages be to have meaningful effect? You just said earlier, our own Minister of Finance announced close to a $7 billion stimulus package from multilateral institutions. We also see FIRS coming up with its own palliatives, but a lot of people have even challenged FIRS. At this point, you're asking your citizens to pay taxes. Come on, when other countries are even giving paychecks to their citizens. So how broad is this? You worked at the Central Bank of Nigeria just a few years ago at the top echelon. at the post of a deputy governor. So you can imagine what your colleagues are passing through right now. The CBN has also come up with its own stimulus measures across board. What do you think of all this? Is it big and broad?
First of all, I commiserate with my colleagues in the central bank because I can imagine what burdens and pressures they must be under. But I want to say that the excessive reliance on the central bank is one of the symptoms of the failure of the Nigerian state. Let me be very clear. It's almost as if we have no fiscal authority in Nigeria. Everything, people, even in the government, every situation and every crisis, their natural instinct is to look to the central bank. And this has meant a massive expansion of the role of the central bank that has quite clearly crossed into fiscal territory. The central bank is a monetary authority and a regulatory authority. So this is a symptom of very weak state capacity. Now, the size of the stimulus, I don't believe that anything less than 2 to 3 trillion can address the problem of the COVID crisis effectively. The question then is, as we discussed before, how the fiscal authorities they don't have it, obviously. So they're looking either to borrow externally or looking to the central bank. Now, if they are successful, tomorrow the IMF will make a decision on whether to give Nigeria $3.4 billion in the rapid financing facility. These are the reports I've seen in the international press. When they get that money, what will they do with it? Let me tell you what they should do with it. At least $1 billion or two of it should go directly into a palliative program for the Nigerian people. Use the poverty surveys, use the bank verification number, the BVN, to identify, at least in the beginning stage, people who should receive these kinds of palliatives. That's number one. Now, the next thing I think they should do is that at least $500 million from this $3.4 billion loan from the IMF must go to the establishment of a public-private venture capital fund. I've been calling for a 1 trillion naira venture capital fund. At least $500 million will probably give you maybe the exchange, if you exchange at about 400 naira to $1, you can get about 200 billion or something to that effect. Now, you should establish a venture capital fund that will give equity capital to unemployed youth and urban slum dwellers and rural poor to set up their own businesses. This is how you will create employment. That's how it's going to be. And this venture capital fund should be run by the private sector. It should not be run by the government. Our government has demonstrated zero capacity to implement programs. So I think let's be honest with ourselves and bring in the private sector and establish some sort of partnership, how this can be run to re-stimulate the economy once again and create employment.
Okay, Prof. What we are not also looking at, or perhaps we are not thinking about in the country, is the human capital issues that coronavirus would also create. Our educational sector, educational system is down now. A lot of people are out of school. Some may not even return to school after this because there's no money for that. How do you think that we should handle the long-term human capital issues this crisis will create? Bearing in mind that investing in our people, especially health and education. Now, coronavirus has exposed us clearly. So, absolutely. How do we handle the issues moving forward?
Moving forward, the 2021 budget should have a totally different template. Right now, education and health have less than each 5% of the budget. That's a scandal. We need to begin to invest in our human capital. The health section of the budget should not be less than 10% in 2021. The education section of the budget should not be less than 15%. The health should go to 15% ultimately, because that's what the African leaders agreed at one of their conferences more than a decade or two ago. But Nigeria has just not done it. So we need to get our priorities right. it's okay to say you want to build roads and bridges and all that, but without investing in your own people as the #1 priority, I think you're not putting the sequence correctly. It is the human capital that will lead to other kinds of investment coming into the country, including for physical infrastructure. So that's #1. The budget should pay far more attention to healthcare and to education. Now, these palliatives or these loans that we're taking should also be invested in human capital, healthcare. You know, every geopolitical zone must have a world-class hospital. Every state should have at least one decent hospital, and then primary healthcare at the local government areas. A lot of investment, a lot of planning and thinking should go into this. But you have the problem of corruption also to deal with.
Okay, Prof, let's talk about this nosediving oil price, because the issue just a few days ago, I looked at Moneyline trading at around 14 to 15 US dollars. It's still within that. It's still within that range, even today. How would Nigeria be able to diversify without all money trickling in as it used to trickle in? Where should Nigeria get the money right now?
They have nowhere to get the money except the loans they are trying to take. And if they are not careful, taking all those loans when you are not generating revenues will lead you to a sovereign debt crisis. Now, I think the problem with diversifying the Nigerian economy is a political problem. That's the problem we have had for a long time. There is no real political will because there's a lot of corrupt incentive. The NNPC should be privatized. I have been saying this for years. If you don't privatize the NNPC, you are just not doing what you should be doing because it will not be profitable. You see what I'm saying? It should be privatized 51% to 49%. Maybe 51% government, 49% private sector. That's why the liquefied natural gas company is doing very well and operates as if it's in a different planet. But the NNPC, which is only government owned, is just very opaque. So that's #1. Number two, we need to create the necessary incentives for diversification. What do I mean? Nigeria has to proactively devalue the naira. Do you understand?
It's coming from a former central bank official?
Yes, they have to float the naira. I'm sorry, I know it's controversial, but you have to have, determination to reposition the economy. Why? When you float the naira, you don't just leave it at that, because all we have done is to wait until we have a crisis, then we devalue and just import inflation. That's not the point. You must, alongside that, create incentives that will drive an export economy of finished value-added goods. That's what happens if you devalue and create trade policy that you can give subsidies to manufacturers who export goods, provided they show proof of export orders. This is how the Asian countries were able to rise. So we have to create incentives for people to begin to export finished value-added goods, and we must abolish the petrol subsidy.
Okay, Prof, I have to butt in.
Not consumption.
Prof, I have to butt in. We have less than 1 minute to end this interview. And I will need you to answer this in about 30 seconds. Where do you stand? Absolutely. Should the lockdown be lifted, yes or no?
We should plan for lifting the lockdown a month from now.
Sorry? I didn't hear you. Should the lockdown be lifted?
Lockdown a month from now.
A month from now to lift it?
You can't have the lockdown, yes. You can't have the lockdown permanently, especially when we have such a weak state. And when you lift it, then you must prepare for the public health implications of lifting it. Compulsory face masks, things like that. A lot of things have to come in. Okay,
so that sums it up for us. How to open up and open up safely. That's what you're saying. But
exactly.
we should open up in a month's time from now, not lifting it right now.
So.
Okay.
I believe so.
Okay, Prof, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you for your insights, and it's been nice speaking with you, at least after so many months.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. That's the much we can